Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Goldstein, and I am delighted to introduce this afternoon's book talk on Co-Cities, Innovative Transitions Towards Just and Self-Sustaining Communities. Before we begin, I'd like to direct your attention to the chat, where the MAS staff has placed some helpful hints, including information about closed captioning for this afternoon's event. Throughout the event, the staff will also be sharing links to our authors' website so that you can find and follow their work. If you need any assistance during the event, please feel free to message MAS using the chat function. Throughout the event, we also invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of our speakers. We will answer those questions throughout the event, or certainly towards the end. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Sheila R. Foster and Christian Iaione, the co-authors of this 2022 publication. This talented pair of academics and researchers came together to develop their brilliant co-city framework as explored in the book. During this program, the authors will take us through the theory behind their framework and then engage in conversation with our moderator, Jennifer Bradley. Before we dive in, I am honored to introduce our three magnificent speakers. First, I'd like to welcome Sheila R. Foster to the stage. Sheila is the Scott K. Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. She holds a joint appointment with the Georgetown Law School and the McCourt Public Policy School. Sheila is well known for her articles and books on environmental justice, including From the Ground Up, Environmental Racism and the Rise of the Environmental Justice Movement, and the Law of Environmental Justice. Sheila has worked with government agencies and public officials on a range of issues, including environmental justice and climate policy. She was the chair of the Advisory Committee on the Global Parliament of Mayors from 2017 to 2020, and is a member of the New York City Mayor's Panel on Climate Change, where she co-chairs the work group on climate equity. Sheila also co-directs LabGov, an international applied research project that has pioneered a new model of urban governance and a path towards more equitable management of a city's infrastructure and services. Welcome. Secondly, we have Christian Iaione. Christian is a professor of public law, teaching courses on urban law and policy, law and policy of innovation and climate change at the Luz Guido Carli Law Department, where he is also the Deputy Director of Blockchain and Innovation Law Lab, coordinator of the innovation area of the Luz School of Law, faculty co-director of the Graduate School of Law, Digital Information and Sustainability, and faculty co-director of LabGov. Christian is also an affiliated fellow at the Urban Law Center at Fordham University and co-lead expert of the URBAC UIA Code for Cities project, and a member of the Urban Partnership on Innovation and Responsible Procurement with the Urban Agenda for the EU. He coordinates the City Science Office of the City of Reggio Emilia and represents it within the European Commission City Science Initiative. Lastly, I will introduce our moderator, Jennifer Bradley. Jennifer is a senior fellow at the Kresge Foundation. She supports the American Cities program at Kresge through convenings and thought leadership. She joined the foundation in 2021. Previously, Jennifer served as the director of the Center for Urban Innovation at the Aspen Institute, where she focused on inclusive innovation and equitable economic development strategies in cities. Jennifer has also held positions with the Brookings Institute, where she co-authored the Metropolitan Revolution and developed state-level strategies to support metropolitan growth, economic growth, and with the Constitutional Accountability Center, where she co-authored amicus briefs in major appellate courts that support environmental protections and community development. A native of Austin, Texas, Jennifer earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Texas, a Master of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, and a Juris Doctorate at the Georgetown University Law Center. She serves on the board of the Edla Vetch DC Jewish Community Center and Open Contracting Partnership. I am delighted to welcome Sheila and Christian to actually present their exciting research that they explored in their book. And just as a reminder, as you're looking at the slide presentation, if you want to see the slides or the speakers, larger or smaller, you can use the slider to do that. So thank you very much, Sheila and Christian, and we look forward to your discussion.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And on behalf of Christian and I, we are absolutely delighted to be here. And thank you to Mass for having us. If you can bring up the slides now. Christian and I are going to take a few minutes, about 10 minutes, to talk through the idea behind the book and what we found in the book, and try to describe this idea of the co-cities. And where I want to start is the intellectual foundations of the book. Both Christian and I separately and then together have been writing a long time, at least 10 years, probably more, on this idea of the common, the urban commons. I started writing about it to examine the ways that urban residents are managing common or shared resources, such as community gardens, parks, streets, as well as other resources without the government or the state, in this case, the local government, being in charge solely of those resources. And learning as much as I could from Elinor Ostrom, who wrote about the commons in the natural resources context. And Christian at the same time was writing about urban roads as a commons. We then came together to begin to write about the entire city as a commons, the infrastructure of the cities as a shared asset from which urban residents and others could generate new kinds of goods and services that would meet their needs. And in that article, The City as a Commons, we propose this idea of urban collaborative governance aimed at managing a host of city resources and addressing a lot of city challenges, including climate change, through this lens. Next slide, please. And as we began to study and then even to experiment ourselves with different kinds of shared resources in cities, we launched a larger empirical study, which is reflected on the map here, trying to understand under what conditions urban resources can be shared, are shared with which actors, and how that happens in different political, social, and economic contexts. And this is what we call the Co-Cities Project, in which we ended up, I think it's now over 200 cities and well over 550 cases, meaning projects or policies in cities that support or that illustrate the idea that urban resources can be shared and co-managed and co-stewarded by residents along with others. And at the same time, we were ourselves beginning to put these ideas into practice, and Christian will talk about this some, first in Bologna, Italy, and then eventually here in the US. And these are some of the cases that we discuss in the book, what we call exemplary cases that are pulled from this larger data set, which really illustrate this idea of parts of the city being co-managed or co-owned or co-stewarded as a commons. Next slide, please. And out of the empirical study in our own experience with the idea of co-managed or co-stewarded or co-governed resources, we extracted the following design principles, again, very much walking in the methodological footsteps of Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning work, in which looking at co-managed natural resources or co-governed, she articulated the conditions under which she noticed they could exist and sustain themselves. Noting the differences between urban resources and natural resources, what we did is that we began to extract some of the recurring themes or principles that we saw, starting with the idea of collective governance. And Christian will talk about this, the idea that there's a collectivity usually of about 5 actors that come together around these resources to collaboratively govern or manage them, that the state is involved in some way, in part because the local government or a higher authority usually has regulatory or legal authority over the assets and or has resources that need to be shared along with other actors. What we call pooling economies, that often these work when we pool both actors and also the resources of actors to either create or co-manage a good like housing or even a park, that a lot of the ways this happens is experimental, adaptive to each context. Every context is different. We can't just simply cut and paste what happened in one place and apply it to another. And then we found that technology or access to technology is really critical in all of these projects, what we call tech justice, that the communities that will benefit from these goods and services often are involved and sometimes even need technological resources and access. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Chris, who will continue on with our journey through coast cities.
Thank you, Sheila. And yes, and essentially the main insight that we extracted from the observation of those case studies, but also through the experimentations that we run in several cities in the European Union first and now in the US, is that cities need to get away from dichotomic logics, break away from the normal dichotomy of the public-private divide, and going towards a larger cooperation of the 5 actors that in a city are really able to deliver social justice and urban innovation. And we merged at this point also the literature on urban innovation, Ostrom and in urban innovation, meaning that the idea that the innovation is the result of the triple helix, public, private, and knowledge institutions. Essentially, what our book does is advancing the idea that we need civil society organizations and also social groups, individuals, innovators, younger generations, sitting at the table and becoming partners in these larger multi-stakeholder partnerships that, in order to get to get design, need a language and need a process. And that's why, and we can go to the next slide, we also, both by observing and by practicing, we came up with our own methodological protocol in order to really understand how these 5 actors, the innovators, the social innovators as the main actors, could interact with all these other stakeholders in a very fruitful and effective way. And it always starts with the as Ostrom used to say, a cheap talking, an informal discussion without any kind of obligations, without sanctions, as she would say. But the idea is that essentially you start talking about what is the common interest in a city, in a neighborhood, in a district, and then you start mapping the resources, the actors that need to be part of these coalitions, these larger partnerships. Instead of running into immediately defining the rules of engagement, the policies or the business models or whatever is formal, we suggested and we understood that it was important to practice first and to experiment, to understand what could work in a single context and what could not work in a single context, because we think that every community, every city, every district has to write their own rules, their own governance mechanisms. And then, later prototyping, but also investing a lot of time on testing and evaluating, observing the life of these prototypes, and then finally model only after a thorough evaluation of the impacts that were produced, also in order to fix all the possible weaknesses of these prototypes. And if we can go to the next slide, what we discovered is that, every city, every neighborhood can reach a sort of, on this ladder of co-governance, much like Einstein used to call the ladder of participation, different degrees of co-governance, from granting access to a shared space and giving bringing back to public use important resources, all the way towards the polycentric governance, where you understand that it's possible to share also the governance of networks. So Sheila was talking about my early work on urban networks, roads, but also digital infrastructure and energy infrastructure. And that's where you really have the ultimate level of co-governance. Last is and if we can go to the next slide, is the important lesson that we learned, that is not just about, recognizing the right of local communities to be to have a seat at the table, but and design legal or other partnership tools, but it's also about the toolkit, the need for a policy that is comprehensive, that also creates the need for new institutional infrastructures, new kind of civil servants, new skills in the public administration, as much as also the use of digital networks to really nurture the participation and the cooperation of all the actors in the city. And of course, what we learned is also that it's more successful when the financial ecosystem is supportive, both the public and the private financial ecosystem. And now that we are living in an age where sustainable development goals, SDGs, inclusion and diversity, and other social justice issues are becoming very important and very relevant, from this point of view, we believe that this kind of purpose-driven financial tools should be used also to nurture the idea of urban co-governance and co-cities. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Great. I really appreciate that extraordinary overview of a lot of complicated both theoretical and practical learning. What you've done just makes the co-cities idea really accessible and is a great jumping off point, I think, for our conversation. So the first thing I want to know is, how did you two come to work together, right? Sheila, you mentioned your path around kind of urban gardening and those community spaces. Christian, your somewhat opposite path on urban highways or urban roadways as co-space. You come from very different political traditions, very different understandings of the role of the state, different levels of federalism. What made the two of you say, oh no, actually there's tons of I'm not going to use the word synergy. There's tons of resonances, and we could do something together.
I'm going to let Christian take this, since he bravely reached out to me one day. But I will just say, when someone invites you to come to Italy, you never say no. But over to you, Christian.
So of course, I met Sheila first in writing, in her articles about the urban commons, and I saw immediately the possibility for cooperation. I graduated from NYU, and then when I went back to Italy, I was somehow changed, in the sense that I wanted to engage with reality. I didn't want to be just the regular lawyer or legal scholar that was not delivering some impact in society. Much like architects do. They have their own projects that somehow leave a sign in the city, right? So I started, experimenting in cities, first in Italy and then in the EU. And right from the start, I reached out to Sheila and said, we have similar ideas. You're working on the same issue. Let's meet for a coffee at Caffè Reggio in New York. I was back in New York, and over a conversation, we started this series of projects. Bologna, and Sheila mentioned Bologna, but there are now many other cities in Italy, Turin, Reggio Emilia, which is the city where we are still now working on a new regulation on urban climate justice and democracy, and with very different and very sophisticated ideas about how to further develop this with citizen assemblies that are discussing the climate issues, the climate change issues affecting the city, and then the word of mouth and other cities, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Gdańsk in Europe wanted to work with us and use our and actually we wanted to be useful to these cities, and that's how we started working in other EU cities.
And I will just add to that, one of the things that drew me to the work Christian was doing when he was drafting the regulation in Bologna. When you think about Europe 20 years ago, you don't think about diverse communities. But if you go to Europe today, one of the things that I quickly recognized were that there were haves and have-nots, and issues of ethnicity and migration were creating the kind of stratified cities that we see in the US and all over the world. So I was very much interested in an approach to a city serving all those communities and those communities sharing in the city's assets. And that started really, I think what Christian started in Bologna was just groundbreaking. And we've improved it from there, but that really was an important start. And I was very drawn to that.
Great. There's a lot to unpack here, right, about the role of the state as either generative and supportive in communities, and what happens when the state withdraws and leaves communities too much on their own, but also what happens, and I'm certainly familiar with this in the United States context, when the state comes into a place and is actively harmful. Redlining, environmental injustice, citing decisions, highways. I mean, the litany goes on. How do you think about kind of right-sizing the role of the state? Because as you say, there's a lot of regulatory involvement, but the state also needs to withdraw a little bit and hand over and delegate. So how does that work? And as if that weren't a complicated enough question, how does this work with trust, right? The state has been a very unwelcome actor in a lot of US neighborhoods, or is only showing up for the first time, perhaps in some European neighborhoods after a long time of neglect. How do you manage that relationship of the state and people and the trust or mistrust between them that really needs a lot of healing?
I mean, it's very different in different contexts. I'll let Christian talk about Europe, but I think one of the things our model tries to account for in that adaptive experimental pillar is exactly to understand where you are in the history of where you are. So almost all of the communities I've worked in, starting with my work in environmental justice, are deeply suspicious of the state and deeply distrustful because the history of the state, as you say, de jure desegregation, redlining after that, urban renewal policies after that, opportunity zones and Hope 6 that demolished the neighborhoods. And even now, we still see state citing of bad things in poor minority neighborhoods. So the first thing we need to do, and this goes back to the co-city cycle, is to understand that context and enter into these contexts knowing and being open to that conversation. Having said that, right, one of the things we say is that communities cannot go it alone. I mean, I think because of the distrust of the state, many communities want to go it alone, right? And I think we've staked out very clearly that for capacity reasons, for legal and regulatory reasons, that's just, and for pooling reasons, that is just not realistic in most places. The only question is how you position the state. And that is very much an applied question in each place. Over to you, Christian.
Yeah, regarding EU cities, the distrust was there. But the distrust was nurtured in the European Union cities after, the economic crisis by the approach that many governments took to dismiss and privatize a lot of public spaces and public services, to detriment of the vulnerable communities that would not have access anymore to essential infrastructure and essential services. And so communities came together in order to claim back these spaces and these services and this infrastructure. And, you know, it was first and foremost a claim to regain the centrality of the public interest, but co-designed with local communities. And the idea was exactly this, that the state after the crisis was not supposed to be anymore the Leviathan who commands and control, but it has to be a partner that sits at the table and enables the cooperation and the discussion and the conversation between the different actors in the city, also acting as a sort of support to communities when interacting with other actors in the city.
And when you go through the cycle of prototyping and experimenting, that creates room for failure, right? Something is not going to go like you thought. Certainly when we think about a lot of contexts, civic contexts, again, in the United States, which I know more than any other place, failure is just like, that's it. You fail once, it's all done, right? We tried that and it didn't work, so we're not going to try it again. And that can come from, again, a public authority, that can come from people saying, we put all this work into a thing and it still blew up. How do you keep people going all the way around that magnificent cycle when it gets really hard, when things don't go as planned? I'm sure that's a very adaptive question, but are there ways to keep people moving around this difficult generative circle?
So one of the things we talk about are spaces where that experimentation and failure can happen that's not rooted in government or even in civic organizations. Often those are knowledge institutions and universities. Sometimes they're laboratories that the city has set up, right? So we talk about these intermediaries that both can help pool the actors, also to help bring capacity to those actors that may not have it, the social innovators as well as the civic organizations, and also that have the resources to experiment and to test and to regroup and do it, so that you don't have local resources, government resources are an issue on both sides, right? I mean, cities don't have money to be experimenting and failing, as you say. So I think universities and knowledge actors, the kind of fourth purpose of the university, right? The impact is one of the things that we talk about. And again, I'll pass it over to Christian because I know he has more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, on this idea that experimentations and experimenting in the city is a sort of grammar of the city, and we need to start understanding the importance of this as a language between different actors. And in this, in this dialogue, universities can play, but also research centers, cultural centers, schools, in some neighborhoods, schools where the real engines of this dialogue and this exchange. And these are the places where people, in any case, are, when there is a crisis in a neighborhood, that's where people are going to convene. So we need to make sure that city governments, as much as possible, understand the importance of creating this new kind of institutional platforms. Not the usual, bureaucratic office. There is plenty of examples in New York to Amsterdam to Italian cities and all over the world, where civil servants sit together with social movements, social organizations, individuals that have ideas, that have energies. They want to put this energy into this great organism that is the city, and to tackle all the challenges that a city has to face these days. And we know that they are daunting.
Great, thank you. One of the conversations that is happening right now in urban space is the narrative, which comes up with seeming regularity, about cities are doomed. Right. I've been in the urban business for probably 25 years, and cities have been doomed kind of that whole time, either because they're too weak or they're too strong, or there's something always wrong with cities in the popular narrative. And right now we are hearing a lot about an urban doom loop where because of new patterns of work, space, and time. And I'm wondering if the Co-Cities framework is an interesting intervention or rejoinder, or can do something with this narrative.
I'll let Christian take that first. Want to?
Again, this was at the beginning, one of the reasons why people came together and started in cultural and creative spaces, in social spaces, the idea of collaborating and cooperating in different cities was because the inner city at that time, after, if you remember the economic crisis at the beginning of this century, they were empty. And so they said they wanted to reclaim back these spaces and use them as spaces where people could deliver community services, creative activities, and the like. Now, Sheila knows that I'm working on a piece that has to do with this doomsday, as they call it, which is, of course, climate change, and I believe that somehow cities are here to stay, because there might be a cycle in which people, especially after the pandemic, feel the need to, get away from the city because of what happened through the pandemic. But in the long run, the cities where all the energies, all the resources can be agglomerated to give a common response to these global challenges that cannot be tackled in small, neat communities, homogeneous communities, because you would also lose, the thriveness and the prosperity that diversity can bring. So I think that this is how actually, if we have a chance at saving humankind from the sixth mass extinction, as someone say, and not me, is the cities. And that's happening already. That, especially if we look at Africa and how people are moving away from, unfortunately, vulnerable communities that are suffering from droughts and the impossibility to farm the essential products of the land in order to feed themselves. They're not migrating as most of my, connationals say, to Italy or to Europe. They are migrating internally towards urban centers, and they are creating the urban continent, which is Africa. And that shows that cities are the place where we need to tackle all these issues, and we need to make sure that democracy, social justice, inclusion, and diversity are respected. Because otherwise, we end up with human agglomerations that will not respect these basic human rights and values.
Yeah, and I mean, here, I think we do see clearly some urban reshuffling, right? I mean, so the core of San Francisco's, New York, in particular, the coastal cities that had the agglomeration of capital and business, that's being threatened because people aren't coming back to work. There's a lot of vacancy in offices. And so I think that's a large part of this doom and gloom, and people have migrated out, right? Having said that, and I wrote a piece about this called Infrastructure Sharing in Cities, I think for Yale Law Journal, post-pandemic, one of the things we saw during the pandemic actually was a lot of infrastructure sharing by city, a lot of co-city activity, in the sense that because of the available space, buildings, empty streets, et cetera, that became unusable, or at least temporarily, we saw cities quite effectively respond by sharing those assets, sharing streets with restaurants, sharing streets with, so the public estate, what we call public property that belongs to all of us, expanding that to bring more people in. But also, I pointed out private proprietary property of cities, which is the empty offices and hotels. We saw cities repurposing that for housing for the homeless, right? Or Seattle gave land and money and an old fire station to Black Lives Matter's protest, to a community land trust in a segregated urban area. So we saw cities' willingness to do this when they really thought that cities were imperiled. Now that we know cities aren't truly imperiled, but they're simply changing, I think there's an extraordinary opportunity. And I think we see some cities in their states taking this to utilize the infrastructure of the cities in a way that shares it with populations that have less of it, that are housing insecure, right, et cetera. And so I think the co-city is an amazing, or that there's an amazing opportunity to think in a co-city-like way for the ways that cities must adapt and develop post-pandemic when there has been an urban reshuffling.
I really like that, because I think that helps us see a very positive and kind of abundance mindset shift, that this property may not be taxable in the same ways that we've thought, but it could be really generative, and to see what's in that possibility space of generative, whatever's happening with the tax rolls. There's so much beautiful language when you talk about this, right? Innovation, the grammar of the city, language, and dialogue of the city. One of the lovely sentences in your book is, and I believe you're quoting, and I won't pronounce this well, Lefebvre?
Yes.
Is the idea that urban is a process rather than a fixed set of resources. And I think, again, you see this with every generation, that it is the residents, the citizens with a small c, who are constantly making and remaking the city. In the research that you've done in your extraordinary database, do you have a favorite example of urban as a process rather than a fixed set of resources?
I mean, I think you can see it when I first started looking at this. You can see it in the not the crisis that Christian was talking about in Europe, but the American crisis in the 80s and 70s in cities, when Mayor Giuliani was mayor in New York. The way that communities responded on open vacant lots that were being dumped on, where there was a lot of drug trafficking and a lot of violence, they came together and they remade their neighborhoods by creating gardens, community gardens. And that's how I first got into this, because there was actually a court case brought by environmental justice advocates. So here's my past and present life coming together, that tried to save those gardens, right? When Giuliani wanted to sell them off to, in part, create new housing. And so there is what is the city during a point of what some said was doom and gloom, right? When we thought no one wanted to live in New York again. It is that the process of city making, making and remaking the city, starts in neighborhoods. It often starts with infrastructure. And it is often, we saw pooling there. It wasn't just the residents that lived there, but what we know from empirical studies, it was people coming from all over the city to help out, creating both bonding social capital, but also bridging social capital. So communities that were segregated and stratified were working with others outside of their neighborhoods to create the city that they wanted, which was a safe city that provided green space that was generative. So that changed because the process changed, right? The economics, the macroeconomics of the city changed and became the New York we know today. And then you see the struggle of those communities and those assets with the government, and that even got worked out as a process matter. So that's one example I have. Christian may have more.
The concept of process makes me think about, the democratic process and the economic process. And from that point of view, I think that the city of Naples, from the first point of view, the idea that, as you know, cities are also a place of conflict. And especially in Naples, this was a way to claim back the right of city inhabitants, cultural and creative collectivities to use spaces that were abandoned or not in service anymore. And the other point is that they were able even to rethink the local public utility in a very, when we talk about polycentric governance and we talk about urban roads or water infrastructure or energy infrastructure, that's where you really have the possibility to to state that you are going towards the ultimate level of co-governance, that, you know, even a water utility was redesigned into a commons. But Turin was able to demonstrate that this is also something that could nurture an economic process, because they were able to create startups and new economic venture that are self-sustainable. There is also Torino Social Impact, which is an important, which convene all these stakeholders and channeled all the resources and towards this social and solidarity economy movements and initiatives. And, you know, for instance, they created, even speaking of housing, a startup that is called Homes for All, which essentially is a way to regenerate abandoned buildings and put abandoned apartment units and put them at service of people that are in dire need of housing, and families that have lost their houses. So in some way, this is also an economic process, and that co-cities can really deliver.
Marvelous. It looks like we are getting some audience questions, and so I'll turn to that in a couple of minutes. But I want to ask my final question that I always do as a moderator, which is, if there's one thing that the audience walks away from or clicks away from at the end of this, what would you like it to be? Christian, I'll start with you.
I mean, the idea that this is something that is, again, citing Lefebvre, is the result of a collective effort. You know, it's he used to say that cities are the constant work of the city inhabitants, and it takes time. And you mentioned failure, and we should not be too pessimistic about the failures, because also markets and governments fail. No, but, you know, very seldomly these failures find punishments, right? So we need to embrace also this from the point of view that we need to invest more on and give and trust more vulnerable communities, and the possibility that in these communities the idea of co-cities can be part of the solution. Of course, it's not going to solve everything, but it could be also the trigger to start a new conversation around problems in vulnerable communities.
Okay. Sheila.
Yeah, I mean, very similar. I think I started this when I talked about, you know, going to Bologna with Christian and seeing a lot of hope. The model is hopeful. Particularly, I think, for communities in the US that are marginalized, not just vulnerable, but marginalized historically from the state and from our economic system, sometimes intentionally, but mostly through neglect and, you know, structural failures, that there's hope in this model, right? There's hope that we can put something in place through the processes we decide. It's hard work. We shouldn't romanticize it. But I think there's hope for communities that I've worked in all my life that have lost a lot of hope, lost a lot of hope in the system, lost a lot of hope in academics that come in and don't speak their language, don't understand where they are, don't get the history, you know, and keep coming back and say, we're going to test, we're going to experiment, we're going to do this. Oh yeah. And then don't leave anything behind, from government programs that promise stuff and give a lot of money, but they don't see it. So this, I think, is a hopeful process. It's a hopeful, and so that's what I want people to walk away from, is whether you buy the whole thing or not. I think there's something in there that will give you hope to try to a new approach. And partly that's what we're trying to lay out.
Great. That's a great place to move into some of the audience questions. An anonymous attendee says, how do you recommend convening all of the sectors that you identified on one of the slides? And I wrote them down, but there's a lot of, you know, the public authorities, the social innovators, the civic organizations, the schools and universities and businesses. Is there an optimal way to get all of those people and institutions around a table and working together?
I think we can give you a lot of different examples of how it's worked. I don't think there's So the one thing that's not is prescriptive. I don't think there's one way, but a couple of things guide us, right? One is bottom up, right? Which is that we always work from the community. Well, I don't want to romanticize community, but the place where we are and the people, the individuals that are there and that need to be included. And then from there, work to identify everyone else that can be, should be, and must be at the table. That looks very different. So I'm going to give two quick examples. Project in Harlem started with a civic organization that had convening power, that had relationships with the city. And that also we knew that we could go into public housing, we could bring Microsoft to the table, we could bring the relevant city agency, and that's the pooling, thing happened from there. In Baton Rouge, where I'm working, it was the redevelopment authority that held all the land that already was engaged in a planning process that involved the relevant communities. We were outsiders in that case. But in both cases, there's an anchor institution, could be in the city, it could be in the community, it could be a church, and that is an opening. So I would say, and then I think from there, we utilize knowledge institutions, people who are seen as not having a stake one way or the other, but can bring things. And so it does look different. So those are two examples where I came in differently, but the result was the same. And that is, this is an intentional, thoughtful process about mapping actors and resources. And the only question is, where do you start? And where you start sends a signal.
Got it.
Christian.
Yeah, Christian, where?
Yeah, I would say the entry point. Understand what is the entry point and what is the minimum viable product, as they say in the design world, that people at the table can deliver in a short term, with the idea that we work in the medium to long term. So I think that, going back to Sheila's point about academics that go in these communities and don't leave nothing behind, I think that the most important, most urgent thing is what we can deliver together, and in this also the academics for the local community when we start these processes. So what is the common interest? One example was in these neighborhoods, in these outskirts, in these vulnerable communities, vulnerable neighborhoods in Rome, where it was evident that the people we wanted to create, and we want to create, and we are still working after 7 years. So it's nobody's left behind. So we are still there. It takes a lot of years sometimes. The idea that you not only work on something in the long term, but also on the short term. And so it was evident that in the short term, they wanted to create a sort of living memory exhibition of public art. And now there are already public arts, and they have tourists going there. And so you see, it's the small things that you can do immediately together, with the idea that you then start designing the process and the future work together in the long run.
I think we have time for one more question. And this comes from Daniel Tano. I hope I'm not doing violence to the pronunciation of the last name, who asks, in regard to NYC, how does the co-city model work with programs like Mayor Bloomberg's Plan NYC, or the currently developing Office of Public Space, to coordinate efforts to help make public space public and useful for the urban environment and people? So Sheila, as the New Yorker, I will let you know.
So Christian and I actually work with someone in the city of New York who was doing these NYCX collabs in different cities. In different neighborhoods around New York. He's since left the city. But we have had one semi-successful experiment in trying to ground this in New York City. It wasn't around public space. It was more around the model of bringing, in that case, tech entrepreneurs together with marginal neighborhoods to solve their waste recycling or street lighting problem. So it can work in a city like New York if you have the right entry point. Around public space, I'm on the New York City Mayor's Panel on Climate Change. One of the things we've tried to do is to bring the co-city cycle or model to the work. That's around kind of more general public space, meaning the real commons, the earth commons, and to bring different communities into that work. to give the city, help give the city a sense of how people are using space or don't have green space or where green space is needed. I have not worked on public space per se. I will say that there are a lot of programs in New York City already that are co-governed public spaces. There are friends groups around neighborhood parks that the city enables. Obviously, the Park Conservancies, I know there's some issues around them, but you could see some of the programming as having elements of the co-city. But if the question is, can this work in a huge metro megalomic city like New York? I think the short answer is yes. And there have been some experiments that have failed and some that are ongoing, but yes, it can work. Okay. It can work particularly with the current plan, both Bloomberg's and de Blasio's plan that I think have elements of the kind that we've talked about in there.
Got it. Christian, I'm going to give you a different question, which comes from Androniki Papa, and who asks, what would you suggest as key in scaling up from lab or academic institutions kind of experimentation to policy making that actually protects the commons? So how do you, I guess it's sort of, how do you use an element of the commons to protect the commons?
I think that the question is also about the scaling up from the experiments to the policy, right? So, and you know, the easy answer would be political leadership. If you find a, but our experience made us realize that it's administrative leadership. It's the civil servants, it's the policy entrepreneurs that are inside City Hall that most of the time are even more important than the politicians. Why? Because they can allow you to go over the policy cycles. You know, the mayor changes, but they are still there. And if they really believe it, and if they really invest, and normally they also invest their private life, their, you know, free time, because to get, this is not on their workload normally. Right. And so, you know, people in Turin, people in Reggio Emilia, Bologna, Naples, Amsterdam, Barcelona, these are the cases in which I've seen, Gdansk in Poland, I've seen civil servants really running the extra mile. I think that's the key insight that we gather from.
And the same in the US, absolutely. That's so on point. In every case, it's civil servants. It's not the politically elected leaders.
And presumably also within the four walls of an academic institution, right? You have people who might be going outside their remit, right? The community affairs office or individual professors. Does it work similarly that way?
I think academics like Christian and I think it's universities that do have this fourth mission, I think, and a lot of universities are moving toward that impact mission that give academics or scientists, researchers. In every case I've been involved in, there is a lab at a university, there are academics not coming from, I know the kind of office you're talking about, Jennifer, but it's not coming from there. It's not there. Okay. Coming from offices set up in the university to engage with the city. It's not coming from there. It's coming from people who have real capacity to lend the project and who are willing to do that and who pool with others, often through grant funds. So we haven't talked about funding, but often, you know, through government grants or private foundation grants that pool the team together.
Got it. That is a nice segue to what definitely will be our last question, which is, as researchers who live in different parts of the world, can you reflect on successfully collaborating together? And we talked about this a little bit kind of at the intellectual level, but I think this attendee wants to know, like, do you have recommendations for folks who want to do research and projects with collaborators across borders and time zones? Like, almost like, what's your workflow? How do you manage having very different work hours and awake hours? And how does that start to work?
I would say that in Sheila's case is because having a family that is very, you know, understanding and welcoming. In my case, not having a family. I think that this is important. No, I mean, jokes aside, as I explained, it takes a lot of your free time. And last week we hosted a series of meetings also with colleagues in other parts of of the globe. We have LabGov in Costa Rica, and also there is colleagues in Hong Kong University. And it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of good use of digital, but also the physical gatherings. And that's why we try to have at least one in-person gathering every year, so that we can see each other. I'm often in the US, and but again, you know, the real suggestion is also to have a large team of researchers that are not interested just in the research, are interested in, I would say, the mission behind it, the fourth purpose, the idea that our role in society has changed a lot. That's why, for instance, Luis has created this alliance of European universities called ENGAGE-EU, of Engaged University, which the center pillar of this alliance is that the role of the universities in society.
And I will also put in a plug for the lab itself, LabGov, right? It is a place, it's not just academics, it's, you know, PhD students, it's, you know, postdocs, it's people who want to work on these issues that don't respect borders or boundaries, and that may look different in different places, have different histories and different contexts, but we've tried to create a platform, LabGov, in which we can bring these folks together in wherever they are, Africa, Europe, the US, et cetera. But I also spent a lot of time in Rome, so that's the cherry on the cake.
Got it. Well, I think that's a great way to kind of close out, right? Because we've talked about all of the sort of ways that we can connect virtually, as in this conversation, but it does come back to what is so amazing about cities is the opportunity for the variety of face-to-face interactions, the opportunity to have a coffee at Cafe Reggio to talk about ideas from Reggio Emilia. I love how that worked. And what brings us all together is the shared love of the diversity of cities and all the great things that can come from there. So really appreciate the conversation. And now I will turn it back to Elizabeth and the MAS team.
And thank you, Jennifer, for excellent moderation. Thank you.
Yes, I was just going to say thank you, Jennifer, for wonderful questions and engaging a wonderful dialogue here. And thank you especially to Sheila and Christian for this discussion, but also your incredible work that has brought this model forward. I think it helps remind us that we have to act locally to counteract the other doom cycle that we're experiencing in the United States, the one of political divide and strife that sort of happens above us, and gives us hope that the things that we're doing at a local level, if done right, and with all of the collaborative partners you've defined for us so effectively, we can make a huge difference. I also want to thank the MAS staff who helped coordinate this afternoon's event. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you who joined us this afternoon, and special thanks to the MAS members. If you are not a member and enjoyed today's program, we hope that you will consider joining your membership help support MAS programs and advocacy towards a more livable city. See the chat function for information on how to support MAS. We also hope that we'll see you at an upcoming tour or program. Next Wednesday, we're hosting a book talk with writer Sarah Schulman about her 2021 publication, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP, New York, 1987-1993. Sarah will be in conversation with a poet and Lambda Literary Executive Director, Samia Bashir. Please join us in person at P&T Knitwear Bookstore. RSVP details are available in the chat. And also save the date for our 2023 Jane's Walk, New York City Festival, May 5th through 7th. The volunteer-led celebration of urban life is a wonderful way to come together and explore the city we call home. We will announce our 2023 roster and open up registration in mid-April with over 100 walks across 5 boroughs. We hope you will join us this spring to explore someplace maybe you have never explored before. See the chat for more details about Jane's Walk, plus our general tours and programs calendar. And once again, thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you a fantastic rest of the week. Take care.
Thank you.